The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the New Mexico territory as Thomas Fletcher rode along the perimeter of his ranch, checking fence lines that stretched endlessly into the horizon. His weathered hands gripped the reins with practiced ease, dark eyes scanning the barbed wire for breaks or weak spots. The land here was unforgiving, carved from dust and stubbornness, where only the hardiest souls dared to claim their piece of earth. Thomas had been alone on this ranch for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah had succumbed to fever during the harsh winter of 1879. The silence that followed her death had become his companion, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. He preferred it that way. People brought complications, heartache, questions he was not prepared to answer. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, snorted and tossed her head as they approached the eastern boundary. Something was wrong. The wire hung loose in several places, twisted and mangled as if someone had deliberately damaged it. Thomas dismounted, boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a hollow thud. He knelt beside the fence, running his fingers along the cut wire. Clean cuts, made with proper tools. This was no accident. A sound made him freeze. Soft, barely audible above the morning breeze, it came again. A whimper, weak and frightened, drifting from somewhere beyond the damaged fence line. Thomas straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. The territory was dangerous, filled with outlaws, wild animals, and tensions that ran deeper than the Rio Grande. He followed the sound through a cluster of juniper trees, their twisted branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. The whimpering grew clearer, more desperate. Behind a large boulder, partially hidden by scrub brush, he found her. She was Apache, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with long black hair matted with dirt, and tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. Her clothing was torn, a traditional dress made of deerskin now reduced to rags. Blood stained her bare feet, and her small hands clutched at the ground as if trying to anchor herself to the earth. When she saw Thomas, she pressed herself further against the rock, eyes wide with terror. Thomas stopped several feet away, raising his hands slowly to show he carried no weapons. The child watched him with the wariness of a wild animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of creatures that had been hunted, hurt, betrayed by those who should have protected them. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind rustled through the juniper branches, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that made Thomas's stomach clench. Smoke. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, a thin column of black smoke rose into the sky. The girl followed his gaze and made a sound, a keening wail that cut through him like a blade. She pointed toward the smoke, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for her frame. Thomas understood without words. Whatever had happened there, wherever that smoke was rising from, it had something to do with this child. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, gentle as he could manage. "Easy now, little one. I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand his words, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. The rigid terror in her posture eased slightly, though she remained pressed against the rock. Thomas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky, offering it to her with an open palm. She stared at the food, hunger warring with fear in her dark eyes. Slowly, she reached out and snatched the jerky, retreating immediately to gnaw at it with desperate efficiency. Thomas waited, patient as stone, while she ate. When she finished, she looked at him again, and this time her gaze held something besides fear. A question, perhaps, or hope. "My name is Thomas," he said softly, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in inquiry. She watched his gestures carefully but said nothing. He tried again, this time placing his hand over his heart. "Thomas." The girl studied him for another moment, then pressed her own small hand to her chest. "Ayana," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of autumn leaves. Thomas nodded, repeating her name carefully. Ayana. A beautiful name, he thought, though he had no idea what it meant. She seemed pleased that he had said it correctly, and some of the tension left her shoulders. The distant smoke was growing thicker now, and Thomas knew he could not leave the child here alone. Whatever had driven her to flee, whatever had happened at the source of that smoke, she was in danger. The damage to his fence suddenly made sense. Someone had been here, and they had not come with peaceful intentions. He stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Then he walked back to Copper and untied a blanket from his bedroll. Returning to Ayana, he offered it to her. She took it gratefully, wrapping it around her small shoulders like armor against the world. Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He could not leave her here, exposed and vulnerable. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and the Apache reservation was even further. But his ranch was only 3 miles back through the hills, and it was defensible, well stocked with food and water. He pointed toward his horse, then toward himself, then toward Ayana. She understood immediately and shook her head vigorously, pressing herself back against the rock. Thomas did not try to force her. Instead, he sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, and waited. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the desert landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing off the canyon walls. Thomas remained motionless, showing the child that he was willing to wait, that he would not rush her or force her into anything she did not want. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Ayana stood up. She looked toward the smoke, then back at Thomas, then toward Copper grazing nearby. Something passed across her face, a resolution born of necessity and the absence of alternatives. She walked toward the horse, her steps small and hesitant. Thomas rose slowly and approached Copper, stroking the mare's neck and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Ayana watched carefully as he demonstrated that the horse was gentle, trustworthy. When he offered to help her up, she hesitated only briefly before allowing him to lift her onto the saddle. She sat rigidly at first, unfamiliar with riding a horse equipped with saddle and stirrups. Her people rode bareback, in harmony with their mounts, and this Western style felt foreign and uncomfortable. But as Copper began to move with her characteristic steady gait, Ayana gradually relaxed. Thomas walked alongside the horse, leading them back toward his ranch. He could have ridden, could have mounted behind the child and covered the distance in half the time, but he sensed that would be too much too soon. Trust, he knew, was something that had to be earned slowly, especially from someone who had good reason to fear strangers. The journey back to the ranch passed in relative silence. Ayana's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for threats that might emerge from behind rocks or around bends in the trail. Thomas found himself doing the same, though for different reasons. If someone had attacked her people, if they were being pursued, he needed to know about it before they reached his property. As they crested the hill that overlooked his ranch, Thomas felt a familiar surge of pride, mixed with loneliness. The buildings were sturdy and well-maintained, the result of years of hard work and careful planning. The main house was built of adobe and timber, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. The barn was large enough to shelter his livestock during storms, and the well was deep and reliable. But it was also empty, echoing with the absence of the family he had once hoped to raise here. Sarah's vegetable garden had long since been reclaimed by weeds, and the rocking chair she had loved still sat on the front porch, weathered by seasons of disuse. Ayana took in the sight of the ranch with eyes that missed nothing. She noted the defensible position on high ground, the clear sight lines in all directions, the sturdy construction of the buildings. Her people were warriors and survivors, and she had been taught from an early age to assess any new environment for its strategic advantages and vulnerabilities. When they reached the house, Thomas helped her down from the horse. She stood close to Copper, one hand resting on the mare's neck, as if the animal represented safety in this strange new world. Thomas understood and made no move to separate them. "Are you hungry?" he asked, miming the act of eating. Ayana nodded, though her expression remained wary. Thomas led both girl and horse to the barn, where he unsaddled Copper and gave her fresh hay and water. Ayana watched every movement, learning the routines of this place that might become her temporary refuge. Inside the house, Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. He set a plate before Ayana and watched as she examined the unfamiliar food. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, as hunger overcame caution. The coffee made her wrinkle her nose in distaste, but she drank it anyway, recognizing its value as sustenance. While she ate, Thomas studied her more carefully. Despite her obvious ordeal, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of good upbringing and strong family bonds. Her dress, though torn and dirty, had been made with skill and care. The beadwork around the collar was intricate and beautiful, probably the work of a mother or grandmother who had wanted her child to look special. The thought of that unknown woman, perhaps now dead or scattered to the winds, filled Thomas with a sadness that surprised him in its intensity. He had grown accustomed to his own grief, but this child's loss felt fresh and raw, a wound that demanded attention. When Ayana finished eating, Thomas showed her to the small room that had once been intended as a nursery. He had never used it for that purpose, and it had become a storage space filled with boxes and unused furniture. Working together, they cleared out a space and made up a bed with clean sheets and blankets. Ayana examined the room carefully, testing the window latch and noting the single door. Thomas realized she was checking escape routes, planning for the possibility that she might need to flee quickly. The thought that she felt such fear, even here in what he hoped was safety, made his chest tight with emotion. As evening approached, Thomas built a fire in the hearth and settled into his usual chair with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper. Ayana sat on the floor nearby, close enough to the warmth but positioned so she could see both the door and the windows. Her eyes never stopped moving, never stopped watching. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions and unshared grief. Thomas found himself stealing glances at the child, wondering about her story, about the family she had lost, about the events that had brought her to his fence line bloodied and alone. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, a wild harmony that drifted across the desert like the voices of ghosts. Ayana listened intently, her head tilted as if she could understand their language. Perhaps she could. Her people had lived in harmony with this land for generations, reading its moods and seasons with an intimacy that white settlers like Thomas could barely comprehend. When full darkness fell, Thomas banked the fire and showed Ayana to her room. She hesitated in the doorway, looking back at him with an expression he could not quite read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also a kind of resignation, as if she had accepted that her fate was now tied to his, for better or worse. "Sleep well, little one," Thomas said softly. She did not understand the words, but she seemed to understand the sentiment. She nodded once, gravely, and closed the door behind her. Thomas sat up late that night, listening to the sounds of the house settling around them. From Ayana's room came the occasional creak of floorboards as she moved about, and he guessed she was having trouble sleeping. He could hardly blame her. Everything in her world had been turned upside down, and she was now dependent on the kindness of a stranger who belonged to the very people who had brought such devastation to her life. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a white rancher, who had claimed Apache land for his own, now sheltering an Apache child who had nowhere else to go. The contradictions of frontier life, where survival often required putting aside larger questions of justice and history, had never felt more personal. As the night deepened, Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah, about the children they had planned to have, about the family that death had stolen from him. Perhaps this was some kind of divine intervention, a second chance at the parenthood that had been denied him. Or perhaps it was simply the right thing to do, regardless of the complications it might bring. Either way, he knew there was no going back. The moment he had decided to help Ayana, he had committed himself to her welfare, and Thomas Fletcher was not a man who abandoned his commitments. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The last thing he heard before sleep finally claimed him was the soft sound of singing from Ayana's room, a wordless melody that spoke of loss and longing, and the stubborn hope that somehow, even in the darkest times, dawn would still come. Dawn broke gray and sullen across the New Mexico territory, bringing with it a sense of unease that Thomas felt in his bones. He had slept poorly, disturbed by dreams of smoke and distant gunfire, and he woke to find Ayana already awake, sitting by her window and watching the horizon with the intensity of a sentry. Over the following days, a routine began to emerge between them. Thomas would rise early to tend to his livestock, always keeping the house within sight, while Ayana explored the immediate area around the ranch buildings. She moved like a shadow, silent and observant, learning every corner, every hiding place, every potential escape route. Communication between them developed slowly, built on gestures, shared tasks, and the gradual establishment of trust. Thomas taught her simple English words, pointing to objects and repeating their names patiently. Ayana proved to be a quick learner, her intelligence sharp despite her youth. In return, she began to teach him words in her own language, her voice soft and musical when she spoke of familiar things. The girl's presence transformed the ranch in ways Thomas had not expected. The silence that had been his companion for so long now felt less like solitude and more like anticipation. Ayana brought life to corners of the house that had been empty for years, and her quiet movements reminded him daily that he was no longer alone with his grief. She proved remarkably capable for her age. Within a week, she was helping with daily chores, feeding the chickens with careful attention to their individual personalities, and assisting Thomas in the vegetable garden that he had neglected since Sarah's death. Her small hands were skilled at delicate work, and she seemed to understand plants and animals with an intuitive knowledge that impressed him. But beneath the surface of their developing domesticity, tension simmered. Ayana still started at sudden noises, still positioned herself near exits, still watched the horizon with eyes that expected trouble. And Thomas found himself doing the same, his awareness heightened by the responsibility he now carried for her safety. It was on the 10th day that the first sign of real trouble appeared. Thomas was repairing a section of roof when he noticed dust clouds on the eastern horizon, moving too steadily to be natural weather patterns. He climbed down from the ladder and called softly to Ayana, who appeared immediately from behind the barn where she had been feeding the goats. She saw the dust clouds and went rigid, her face draining of color. Without a word, she pointed toward the smoke and then toward herself, making a cutting motion across her throat. The message was clear. Whoever was coming, they meant her harm. Thomas made a quick decision. He led Ayana to the storm cellar behind the house, a stone-lined space that Sarah had insisted on when they first built the ranch. It was cool, dark, and well hidden beneath a covering of old boards and scattered hay. He showed Ayana how to bar the door from inside and gave her a lantern, a knife, and enough food and water for several days. "Stay here until I come for you," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "No matter what you hear, do not come out until I give the signal." He showed her the call he would use, a low whistle that mimicked the song of a meadowlark. Ayana nodded, her eyes wide but determined. She understood the gravity of the situation, and Thomas was struck again by her maturity, by the way trauma had forced her to grow up far too quickly. As he prepared to close the cellar door, she caught his hand and spoke a few words in Apache, her voice urgent and sincere. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood her meaning. She was thanking him and perhaps saying goodbye, just in case. He squeezed her hand gently and whispered back, "I will not let them take you." The riders arrived an hour later, 7 men on horseback, armed and grim-faced. Thomas recognized their leader immediately. Captain William Morrison of the territorial militia, a man with a reputation for brutal efficiency in dealing with what he called the Indian problem. Morrison was tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. He sat his horse with military precision, every line of his posture radiating authority and menace. "Fletcher," Morrison called out as the group approached the house, "we are looking for a fugitive, an Apache girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. We have reason to believe she passed through this area." Thomas stepped onto his porch, keeping his hands visible and his expression neutral. "What makes you think that, Captain?" Morrison's eyes swept over the ranch buildings, noting every detail. "Apache raiders hit the Clearwater settlement 5 days ago, killed a family, burned their homestead. This girl was seen fleeing the scene. She is wanted for questioning in connection with the murders." The lie came easily to Morrison's lips, but Thomas heard it for what it was. He had seen enough of frontier justice to know how these situations played out. A traumatized child would be easier to blame than the complex realities of territorial conflict, and dead Apache could not contradict whatever story proved most convenient. "I have not seen any Apache children," Thomas said carefully. "Just been working my land, same as always." Morrison dismounted and walked closer to the porch, his spurs chinking with each step. "You mind if we take a look around, just to be thorough?" It was not really a request, and Thomas knew better than to refuse outright. "Help yourself," Nothing here but cattle and chickens. The soldiers spread out across the ranch, searching systematically through every building. Thomas watched with forced calm as they poked through his barn, his storage sheds, even his chicken coop. One young soldier emerged from the house shaking his head at Morrison, indicating that they had found nothing suspicious. But Morrison was not satisfied. He was too experienced, too thorough to be fooled by a cursory search. His eyes kept returning to the area behind the house, where the storm cellar lay hidden beneath its careful camouflage. "You know, Fletcher," Morrison said conversationally, "harboring Apache fugitives is a serious crime. Could cost a man his land, maybe even his life." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Good thing I am not harboring any fugitives, then." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then gestured to his men. They began a more detailed search, moving methodically through areas they had already covered. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The storm cellar was well hidden, but it was not invisible to determined searchers. It was Sergeant Hayes, Morrison's second-in-command, who found the first clue. He kicked at a pile of scattered hay behind the house, and his boot struck something solid. The hollow thunk of wood on stone carried clearly in the still air. "Captain," Hayes called out, "over here." Morrison approached with predatory interest, and Thomas felt his heart sink. The soldiers began clearing away the hay and boards, revealing the storm cellar entrance beneath. Morrison smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Well, what do we have here?" Thomas stepped forward, trying to project casual indifference. "Storm cellar. Built it when we first settled here. You know how these desert storms can be." Morrison nodded slowly, but his hand rested on the butt of his pistol. Open it. This was the moment Thomas had dreaded. He could refuse, could try to fight, but 7 armed men against one would end only one way, and Ayana, trapped in the cellar below, would be found regardless. At least if he cooperated, he might be able to find some way to protect her. He knelt and pulled open the heavy wooden door. The cellar yawned beneath them, dark and apparently empty. Morrison peered down into the shadows, then gestured to Hayes. "Take a lantern and check it out." Hayes lit a lantern and descended into the cellar. Thomas held his breath, knowing that Ayana was down there somewhere, hidden in the darkness. The sergeant's footsteps echoed hollowly as he moved through the underground space, the lantern light dancing across stone walls and wooden shelves. Long minutes passed. Thomas could hear Hayes moving around below, searching methodically through the stored supplies and equipment. Finally, the sergeant's voice drifted up from the depths. "Nothing here, Captain. Just preserves and tools." Morrison frowned, clearly disappointed. He had been so certain, so confident in his instincts. But the cellar appeared to be exactly what Fletcher claimed it was, a practical storage space for a working ranch. What Morrison did not know, what Hayes had not discovered in his search, was that Sarah Fletcher had been a woman of foresight and ingenuity. When she designed the storm cellar, she had insisted on a hidden chamber behind the main storage area, accessible through a narrow passage concealed behind stacked preserving jars. It was in this secret space that Ayana now crouched, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of the search above. Hayes emerged from the cellar and shook his head at Morrison. The captain's jaw tightened with frustration, but he had no choice but to accept the evidence of his own eyes. The girl was not here, at least not where they could find her. "Mount up," Morrison ordered his men. Then he turned back to Thomas, his voice carrying a clear threat. "We will be watching this area, Fletcher. If that girl shows up, if you see any sign of Apache activity, you send word immediately. Is that understood?" Thomas nodded. "Understood." Morrison mounted his horse and wheeled it around, ready to leave. But then he paused, something nagging at the back of his mind. He had noticed something during the search, some small detail that did not quite fit. His eyes swept over the ranch buildings one more time, and then he saw it. Near the barn, barely visible in the dust, was a small footprint. Not a man's boot, not a woman's shoe, but the bare foot of a child. The print was faint, probably several days old, but it was there. Morrison dismounted again and walked over to examine the print more closely. Thomas followed, his heart pounding, trying to think of some explanation that would satisfy the captain's suspicions. "Interesting," Morrison murmured, crouching beside the footprint. "You have children, Fletcher?" Thomas shook his head. "Wife died 3 years ago. No children. Morrison stood slowly, his hand moving to his pistol. Then whose footprint is this? The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Thomas could feel the weight of 7 pairs of eyes on him, could sense the soldiers' hands moving toward their weapons. In the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing across the desert silence. Then inspiration struck. Thomas forced himself to look puzzled, as if he were genuinely trying to solve a mystery. Could be from the Hernandez boy, he said. Old Miguel brings his grandson when he comes to trade for milk and eggs. Kid runs around barefoot, gets into everything. It was a plausible explanation, the kind of everyday interaction that defined frontier life. Morrison knew Miguel Hernandez, knew the old Mexican trader had a young grandson. The story fit the facts well enough to create reasonable doubt, but Morrison was not entirely convinced. His instincts told him that Fletcher was hiding something, that the girl was here somewhere. However, instincts were not evidence, and he could not tear apart a man's ranch based on suspicion alone. We will be back, Morrison said finally. If I find out you are lying to me, Fletcher, you will regret it. The soldiers mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Thomas watched until they disappeared over the horizon, then walked quickly to the storm cellar. He gave the meadowlark a call, waited a moment, and heard the scrape of the wooden bar being moved. Ayana emerged from the hidden chamber like a ghost, materializing from shadow. Her face was pale but composed, and she moved with the controlled precision of someone who had faced death and survived. Thomas helped her up from the cellar, noting how her small hand trembled slightly in his. They are gone, he said softly. For now. Ayana nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the soldiers had disappeared. She spoke a few words in Apache, her voice tight with controlled fear. Thomas did not need a translation to understand her meaning. Morrison would return, probably with more men, and next time he would be more thorough. The hidden chamber had saved them today, but it would not fool a determined search indefinitely. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He could not continue to hide Ayana at the ranch. It was too dangerous, too exposed. Morrison suspected something, and the captain was not a man to give up easily. But there was another option, one that had been growing in Thomas's mind ever since he first found the girl by his fence line. He owned land further south, a small cabin near the Mexican border that he had purchased years ago as an investment. It was remote, defensible, and far from the reach of territorial militia. More importantly, it was a place where a white rancher and an Apache child could disappear entirely, could start over as father and daughter without questions about their past. The idea was radical, dangerous, and completely contrary to everything Thomas had been taught about racial boundaries and social propriety. But as he looked at Ayana, saw the quiet courage in her dark eyes, and the way she had begun to trust him despite every reason not to, Thomas knew it was the right choice. Perhaps the only choice that would keep her safe and give them both a chance at the family they had lost in different ways. Tomorrow we leave for the South Country, he said to her, speaking slowly so she could follow his words. A new place, where no one will look for us. Ayana studied his face carefully, reading the determination there. She nodded once, gravely, accepting this new change in her uncertain fate. Whatever lay ahead, she had learned that Thomas Fletcher was a man who kept his promises, who had chosen to protect her when he could have easily turned away. The next morning, they loaded supplies onto a pack horse and set out before dawn, riding south through country that grew wilder and more remote with each mile. Behind them, the ranch stood empty, a testament to the life Thomas was leaving behind. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous but full of possibility. As they rode, Ayana began to sing softly, a traditional Apache song that spoke of journeys and new beginnings. Thomas did not understand the words, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful, full of hope and resilience. It was the sound of a people who had survived countless upheavals, who had learned to adapt and endure no matter what challenges life brought. 3 months later, in a small cabin overlooking a valley where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, a weathered rancher and a young Apache girl had become something neither had expected, a family. Not bound by blood or law, but by choice and necessity, and the kind of love that grows slowly, carefully, in the spaces between words. Thomas had taught Ayana to read and write English, while she had shown him how to read the subtle signs of weather and wildlife that her people had studied for generations. Together, they had built a life that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. The child who had once clung to his leg in terror now worked beside him as an equal partner in their small ranch. She had grown taller, stronger, more confident, but she had never lost the quiet dignity that had impressed him from their first meeting. Her English was now fluent, though she still spoke Apache, when she thought he was not listening, keeping alive the language and stories of her people. Thomas had changed too. The bitter loneliness that had consumed him after Sarah's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose he had never expected to find again. In protecting Ayana, in giving her a chance at a normal life, he had discovered that healing was possible, even for wounds that seemed permanent. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch of their cabin and watch the sun set over the mountains. Ayana would sometimes speak of her lost family, keeping their memory alive through stories and songs. Thomas would tell her about Sarah, about the dreams they had shared, and the children they had planned to raise. These conversations were not sad, but healing, a way of honoring the past while building toward the future. They had both learned that love was not diminished by loss, that hearts could expand to hold new affections without forgetting old ones. The world beyond their valley remained dangerous and divided, full of the conflicts that had brought them together. But in their small corner of the territory, a white rancher and an Apache girl had proven that family was not defined by blood or race or social convention, but by the willingness to choose each other, day after day, against all odds. And in the quiet moments between sunset and stars, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, they both knew they had found something precious, a place where they belonged, together. Home at last in the vast and unforgiving beauty of the American frontier.